He didn't look like someone worth noticing, at least that's what everyone thought. A rusted car, oil-stained hands, and a quiet presence in a place where loud money ruled the pavement. But the moment that engine fired, every doubt snapped like a wire under pressure. He'd been mocked, dismissed, laughed at, until the track revealed a truth none of them were ready for. How did a man they treated like nothing end up doing something no one there had ever seen before? The answer starts long before the race even began, in a lifetime of closed doors, stolen opportunities, and a father's dying wish that couldn't be silenced by rust or ridicule. Most people at Claiborne Motorsports Park came to be seen, not to race. It was a weekend playground for the wealthy, polished helmets, imported cars, engines that sounded more like bank statements than machines. The regulars all knew each other, and they liked it that way. The parking lot was a showroom of privilege. Porsches, Ferraris, McLarens, each one gleaming under the afternoon sun like trophies on wheels. Men in designer racing suits laughed over craft beer. Women in expensive athleisure checked their phones between conversations about vacation homes and private schools. This was their world. Curated, exclusive, comfortable. In its sameness, Malik Carter didn't fit the picture they painted of themselves. He showed up alone just after noon, driving past the entrance gate in a faded 1994 Honda Accord coupe with mismatched panels, one primer gray, one sun-bleached red, the hood a third shade entirely. The paint had oxidized years ago into a matte finish that caught light like old bone. A crack spider-webbed across the windshield. The exhaust pipe was held up with wire hangers. To anyone watching him pull into the lot, the car looked like it had survived a natural disaster and lost. Malik stepped out wearing work boots with steel toes visible through worn leather, jeans with permanent grease stains mapping the places. His hands rested most often in a plain gray t-shirt that had been washed so many times the cotton felt more like tissue paper. At 32 years old, he carried himself with the quiet wariness of someone who'd learned to read a room before entering it. His eyes moved across the paddock, taking inventory. Who noticed him, who looked away, who lingered too long with expressions he'd learned to decode in childhood. Grease stained the edges of his shirt and darkened the creases of his palms. His shoes had seen more shop floors than sidewalks, more oil puddles than office carpets. To the crowd milling around the luxury trailers, he was background noise, an outsider who'd wandered into the wrong zip code, someone who clearly didn't understand the unspoken dress code of wealth. A young white couple walking past slowed their pace. The woman whispered something to her partner. They both glanced back at Malik's car, then at Malik, then away quickly, as if they'd accidentally made eye contact with someone begging for change. But racing was the one place where Malik felt like the world couldn't talk over him. On the track, credentials didn't matter. Bank accounts didn't matter. Who your father knew, where you went to college, what neighborhood you grew up in. None of it could negotiate with physics or momentum or the split-second decisions that separated good drivers from great ones. He'd spent years tuning engines most people didn't believe were worth saving. Work came and went: warehouse jobs, delivery driving, overnight shifts at an auto parts store where the manager watched him closer than the white employees, as if expecting something to go missing. Money came slow and left fast. Rent, utilities, his mother's medications, car insurance that cost more because of his address. The math never quite added up, but he made it stretch. Still, his hands knew machines in a way no resume could explain, no background check could measure. He understood the language of metal and combustion, could diagnose a failing bearing by sound alone, could feel a timing issue through the steering wheel before any computer caught it. These were the kinds of skills passed down in garages and driveways, taught through observation and repetition, invisible to the world that decided worth through diplomas and credit scores. That old rusted Accord had been his late father's. Leonard Carter bought it used in 1997 with cash saved from 2 jobs: postal worker by day, janitor 3 nights a week. He'd driven it to work for 15 years, maintained it himself because mechanics charged more when they saw him coming. Kept it running through Chicago winters that killed younger cars. The odometer had rolled past 340,000 miles before Leonard's heart gave out at 59, collapsing in the post office parking lot on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Malik inherited the car along with his father's tools. His debts? and a shoebox full of racing magazines Leonard had collected since the 70s. Every corner of that Accord, every bolt, carried memory and meaning his pride refused to abandon. The seat still smelled faintly of his father's aftershave. The radio was still programmed to the gospel station Leonard listened to on Sunday mornings, but underneath the sentimental exterior, Malik had been building something else entirely. Across the paddock, the people who owned the track were hosting a private event. Luxury trailers lined the pavement mobile lounges with air conditioning, flat screens, and catered food from restaurants Malik had only seen through windows. Men in polo shirts with corporate logos shook hands that felt more like transactions than greetings. Everything here tasted like entitlement served cold with a smile that never quite reached the eyes. And at the center of it all stood Logan Brandt. Tech investor, multi-millionaire at 35. A man whose confidence arrived in every room 5 seconds before he did, dragging arrogance behind it like a shadow he'd learned to mistake for charisma. Logan had made his fortune buying up patents from struggling startups, repackaging their innovations under new branding, and selling to corporations for 10 times what he paid. He called it strategic acquisition. Others called it predatory, but money has a way of rewriting narratives, and Logan's wealth bought him the kind of reputation that made people forget to ask uncomfortable questions. He loved two things: being the loudest and being right. Today, he was surrounded by an audience ready to applaud both. His racing suit was custom-fitted, his helmet hand-painted by an artist who'd worked on Formula One designs. His car, a 2023 Porsche 91 GT3 RS in Miami blue, sat in the paddock like a museum piece, worth more than most people earned in 5 years. Logan noticed Malik's car before he noticed Malik himself. And from that moment, the trouble was already building. Malik moved through the paddock with practiced invisibility. The kind black men learned to wear in predominantly white spaces, head down. Movements deliberate, nothing that could be misread as threatening or out of place. He'd perfected this choreography over decades. In school hallways where teachers watched him differently than his classmates. In stores where security guards materialized in whatever aisle he entered. In job interviews where he had to work twice. It was hard to prove he belonged half as much. He found a spot in the far corner of the lot, away from the main cluster of cars, and began unloading his equipment. A worn toolbox that had belonged to his father. A small cooler with water and a sandwich he'd made that morning. A folding chair with a ripped seat. Everything he owned fit. In the trunk and back seat of the Accord. Around him, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Other racers had entire pit crews friends. Family members, paid mechanics in matching shirts. They had generators powering portable air compressors, hydraulic jacks, laptop computers running diagnostic software. Some had arrived in trailers hauling their race cars separately, keeping the pristine machines protected from the indignity of public roads. Malik had himself. His hands and tools that remembered his father's grip, a trio of younger guys, probably mid-20s, all white. All wearing expensive sneakers that had never seen a day of actual work, walked past Malik's car on their way to the concession stand. One of them stopped mid-sentence, tapping his friend's shoulder and gesturing toward the Accord with his chin. "Yo, is that thing even gonna make it around the track?" He said, loud enough to be heard but packaged in the tone of a joke, giving himself plausible deniability if challenged. His friends laughed. One pulled out his phone and took a picture. "Dude, that's some hood shit right there," another said. "Probably stolen?" They walked on, still laughing, never once looking at Malik. To them, he was part of the scenery, not a person who could hear, not someone whose humanity required consideration. Malik's jaw tightened. He kept unpacking his tools. Years of experience had taught him that reacting only made things worse, gave them the confrontation they wanted, the excuse to call him aggressive, to justify whatever they'd already decided about him, but the weight of it settled into his chest anyway. That familiar pressure. That exhaustion of existing in spaces that tolerated your presence but never welcomed it. He thought about his father, who used to tell him, "Don't let them make you small, son. Don't give them that power." Easy to say. Harder to live, and older. Black man, maybe 60, with gray at his temples and grease under his nails, caught Malik's eye from across the paddock. He nodded, a small gesture of recognition and solidarity. He was working on someone else's car, probably hired help. And he understood something the others didn't. What it cost to stand in spaces like this, what it required to keep moving forward when everything around you suggested you turn back. Malik nodded in return. The exchange lasted 2 seconds, but carried the weight of shared experience, of unspoken knowing. He finished his setup and walked toward the registration tent, where drivers signed waivers and received their time slots. The woman behind the folding table, middle-aged, blonde, friendly smile that dimmed slightly when she looked up and saw him, checked her clipboard twice, as if surprised his name was actually on the list. Malik Carter? She said, pronouncing it carefully, like she was trying to avoid getting it wrong in a way that might be offensive. Yes, ma'am, he said. And you're racing today? That's why I'm here. She glanced past him toward his car, then back at her clipboard. Okay, well, you'll need to pass tech inspection first. Just head over to that tent there. She pointed vaguely toward a white canopy where a heavy-set man in a Claiborne staff shirt was examining another vehicle. I know the process, Malik said. Evenly. I've raced here before. Her smile flickered with something that might have been embarrassment or defensiveness, hard to tell. Of course, sorry, we get a lot of first-timers on weekends. He took his registration packet and walked away, feeling her eyes on his back. The truth was, he'd raced at Claiborne 3 times in the past 2 years, always in smaller events, always. Staying quiet, never drawing attention. He placed in the top 5 twice, but faces like his didn't stick in memories the same way others did. He was always starting from zero, always having to prove himself again, always surprising people who assumed his presence was either a mistake or a novelty. Asterisk tech inspection went smoothly. Though the inspector, a white guy in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard and forearms thick as fence posts, took longer examining Malik's car than he had with the Porsche that went before him. He checked the same bolts twice, looked under the hood 3 times, tested the seat belts with more force than seemed necessary. You built this yourself? He asked, surprised at what he was finding, or more accurately, surprised at what he wasn't. Finding no corner cutting, no safety violations, no amateur mistakes. Most of it, Malik said. The inspector grunted, impressed despite himself. That's a full rebuild. Custom internals? Yes, sir. Turbo or supercharged? Neither. All motor. The man stood up, wiping his hands on his pants, looking at Malik with a reassessment happening behind his eyes. Well, it's clean. Real clean. Don't see that level of work too often. He stamped the inspection sheet. You're cleared to race. Good luck out there. It was the first genuine interaction Malik had experienced since arriving, and he felt something loosen in his chest, a small reminder that not everyone here had already written him off. But that feeling evaporated the moment he drove back toward the paddock. Logan Brandt was holding court near his trailer, surrounded by a dozen people hanging on his words like he was dispensing wisdom, instead of recycled TED Talk platitudes about disruption and thinking differently. He wore sunglasses that cost more than Malik's monthly rent, and a watch that caught sunlight like a signal flare announcing wealth. Someone in Logan's circle noticed. Malik's car first, a woman with platinum hair and designer workout clothes that had never seen a gym. She whispered something, and Logan turned to look. His expression shifted through several gears. Curiosity, amusement, then something else. Something that lived in the space between condescension and contempt. He walked toward Malik's car with the swagger of someone who'd never been told he wasn't welcome anywhere. His entourage followed, phones already out, sensing entertainment about to happen. Malik was bent over the engine bay, making final adjustments to the air intake when Logan's shadow fell across him. Excuse me, Logan said, voice loud enough to attract attention from people nearby. Is this thing actually registered to race, or are you here for the car show? Malik straightened slowly, meeting Logan's eyes. Up close, he could see the spray tan lines near the man's hairline, the veneers that made his teeth too white to be real. Registered to race, Malik said flatly. Logan laughed, not a genuine laugh, but the performative kind designed to invite others to join in. Several people did. No shit? What category? Vintage demolition. More laughter. Phones tilted to capture the moment. Malik said nothing. He'd learned long ago that silence frustrated bullies more than arguments. But Logan wasn't finished. He circled the Accord like a predator examining prey, running his finger along the oxidized paint, making exaggerated faces of disgust for his audience. I mean, I respect the hustle, man. Takes balls to bring this out here. He knocked on the hooed harder than necessary, the sound echoing dull and hollow. What did this cost you, like $500? $1,000? It's not for sale, Malik said quietly. No, I'm sure it's not. Sentimental value and all that. Logan's smile sharpened. But seriously, does it even run, like, reliably? Because if you break down on the track, that's a safety issue. For the rest of us. The subtext was clear to everyone watching. Someone like you doesn't belong here. Your car is trash. You're trash. And we're going to make sure you know it. Malik felt heat rising in his chest, his pulse quickening. Every instinct screamed at him to respond, to defend himself, to wipe that smirk off Logan's face with words that would cut just as deep. But he knew how that ended. A black man showing anger in a crowd of white people became the story. The problem became the reason security got called. So he swallowed it. Like he'd swallowed 1,000 other indignities. Like his father had taught him to swallow them, because survival sometimes meant biting your tongue until it bled. Car passed inspection, Malik said evenly. I'm good to race. Logan's expression flickered with something darker frustration that Malik wasn't playing the role he'd assigned him, wasn't getting defensive or angry or providing better material for the spectacle. Look, Logan said, dropping his voice into a register that pretended to be reasonable. I'm just trying to help you out here, man. This track, these events, they're pretty serious. People get hurt when they're in over their heads. He gestured broadly at the paddock. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at, I don't know, a local street racing thing, something more your speed. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I'm comfortable here, Malik said. Are you, though? Logan stepped closer, lowering his voice. Just enough that the crowd had to lean in to hear. Because looking at you, looking at your car, I'm thinking maybe you saw this event online and didn't realize this Wasen single quotes public. He smiled, all teeth. This is a private event. Invitation only. Usually people at this level have, resources. Sponsors, real equipment. I was invited, Malik said. I have a confirmation email if you need to see it. By who? The track coordinator, same as everyone else. Logan's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being fact-checked, especially not by someone he'd already decided was beneath him. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even they could sense this had crossed a line, moved past playful teasing into something uglier. But no one spoke up. No one told Logan to back off. Because calling out racism meant acknowledging it existed, and that made people uncomfortable in ways they'd rather avoid. Logan recovered with another laugh, playing it off. Well, shit, I guess anyone can sign up these days. He turned to his audience. Diversity initiative, am I right? Some laughed. Others looked away. Malik's hands curled into fists at his sides. Every muscle in his body tensed with the effort of staying still, staying quiet, not giving Logan the satisfaction of a reaction. And then Logan made his mistake. He looked at Malik with an expression that tried to pass as pity but couldn't quite hide the contempt underneath. Tell you what, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear again, back in performance mode. Since you came all this way, and since I'm feeling generous, how about we make this interesting? The crowd perked up, sensing where this was going. You and me, one race. Logan gestured dismissively at the Accord. ... project car against my Porsche. Winner takes bragging rights. He paused for effect. Unless you're scared. The challenge hung in the air, barbed and deliberate. It was designed to be impossible to refuse. If Malik declined, he'd look weak, afraid, confirming every assumption Logan had made about him. If he accepted, he'd provide entertainment for people who'd already decided how the story would end. Malik looked at Logan, then at the crowd. Then at his father's car, he thought about all the nights in the garage, the calculations, the rebuilding, the testing. He thought about every time someone had underestimated him, dismissed him, assumed he wasn't capable. He thought about his father, who'd never backed down from anyone but had taught Malik to choose his battles carefully, to know when. To walk away and when to stand. This wasn't a battle. This was a reckoning. Yeah, Malik said quietly. Let's race. The crowd erupted. Phones went up. Someone started a group chat. Within seconds, word was spreading across the paddock. The guy with the junker just agreed to race Logan Brandt. Logan's smile widened, convinced. He'd already won. Perfect. Let's do this right now. Next available slot. Fine with me, Malik said as Logan walked away, already celebrating with his entourage. One of his friends clapped him on the back and said something that carried on the. One. Dude, you're gonna embarrass that guy. Logan laughed. That's the point. Word spread through Claiborne Motorsports Park like wildfire through dry brush. Within 15 minutes, everyone knew about the race. The Millionaire versus the guy with the rusted Honda. David and Goliath, except most people had already decided. Goliath would win this time. Malik returned to his corner of the paddock, trying to block out the noise of gathering spectators. The phones pointed in his direction. The commentary he could hear from people who thought they were being subtle. This is going to be painful to watch. Why would he even agree to this? Logan's going to smoke him. The Porsche does 0 to 60 in like 3 seconds. Feel kinda bad for the guy, honestly. Malik sat in the driver's seat of his father's Accord and closed his eyes. The interior was familiar worn fabric. The crack in the dashboard he'd tried to glue 3 times, the faint outline of his father's handwear on the steering wheel. He placed his palms where Leonard's used to rest and breath slowly, deliberately, pushing down the anger that wanted to rise and consume him. This wasn't just about Logan, it never was. This was about every teacher who'd assumed he wasn't college. Material and steered him toward vocational programs while encouraging white classmates to apply to universities. This was about the police officer who'd pulled him over for matching a description, in a neighborhood where he'd lived his entire life. This was about the loan officer who denied his small business application despite perfect credit, saying, "The numbers just didn't work," then approving a white applicant with worse qualifications the same week. This was about his father, who'd worked 2 jobs for 30 years and died with $1,200 in savings and a stack of medical bills that buried Malik's mother in debt. This was about being told in 1,000 different ways that he wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't worth the benefit of the doubt. But Malik had something Logan didn't understand. Something money couldn't buy and privilege couldn't teach. He'd learned to turn doubt into fuel. Every closed door had taught him to build his own. Every dismissal had sharpened his focus. Every person who'd underestimated him had given him motivation. They'd never comprehend. He opened his eyes and got to work. The Accord's exterior told one story. The interior told another. Malik had spent 3 years transforming this car in a rented garage bay, working nights and weekends, teaching himself advanced automotive engineering through YouTube videos, forums, and library books about engine dynamics. He'd pulled the original engine entirely and rebuilt it from the block up. The cylinder head had been ported and polished by hand, increasing airflow by 30%. The pistons were forged aluminum, custom ordered from a manufacturer in Japan, capable of handling compression ratios that would destroy stock parts. The connecting rods were titanium. The crankshaft was balanced to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. He'd installed a custom camshaft with aggressive lift profiles, retimed the valvetrain for maximum efficiency, and tuned the fuel injection system to deliver precisely calculated amounts at exactly the right moments. The intake manifold was a hand-fabricated work of art, each runner measured and matched for equal flow distribution. The suspension had been completely rebuilt coilovers, with adjustable damping, reinforced subframes, polyurethane bushings throughout. The brakes were 4 piston calipers grabbed rotors that could stop the car from highway speeds and distances that defied the car's humble appearance. Every modification was calculated, tested, refined. Nothing was done for show. Everything served function. But the real secret was the tuning. Malik had spent hundreds of hours with a laptop and an OBD2 interface, adjusting fuel maps, ignition timing, and throttle response curves. He'd tested on backroads at night, on empty highway stretches at dawn, logging data and making microscopic adjustments, until the engine responded to his inputs like an extension of his own nervous system. The result was a car that produced nearly 3 times its original horsepower while maintaining reliability. It wasn't the most powerful car in the paddock. Logan's Porsche had it beat on paper, but power meant nothing without control, and control meant nothing without the drivers. Skill to wield it. Malik checked his tire pressures one final time, adjusted to account for the track temperature. He verified his brake fluid levels, tested his shifter throw, made sure every bolt was torqued to specification. The older black man he'd noticed earlier walked over, moving slow and deliberate like he had something to say but wasn't sure it. Would be welcome. Mind if I speak plainly? He asked. Go ahead, Malik said. You know what you're doing out there. I know what I'm doing. The man nodded, studying Malik's face. I'm Marcus. I work here sometimes, help out with the cars. Been around racing my whole life. He paused. I've seen this before. Rich white man, black man with something to prove. Doesn't usually end the way it should. What do you mean? I mean, even if you win, especially if you win, they'll find a way to make it not count. Say you cheated, say something was illegal, say it was luck. They'll protect him and punish you. Because that's how it works in places like this. Malik had thought the same thing but hadn't wanted to give it voice. Hearing someone else say it made the weight of it real. So what do I do? Malik asked. Marcus smiled, tired but genuine. You win so clean, so undeniable that even their excuses sound stupid. You give them no room to question it. He extended his hand. And you remember, you're not just racing for yourself. There's a lot of us watching who need to see this. They shook hands, a grip that carried decades of shared experience, of navigating systems designed to keep them out. One more thing, Marcus said. That car of yours, I saw it at tech inspection. That's real work. Your daddy teach you that? Yeah, Malik said quietly. He did. Then you honor him out there. You show these people what we're capable of when they stop standing in our way. Marcus walked back toward the paddock, leaving Malik alone with his thoughts, and his father's car and the weight of a moment that had grown bigger than one race. Asterisk, by the time the race was set to begin, nearly everyone at the track had gathered. Along the straightaway, what started as a private event had become a public spectacle. People stood 3 deep along the fence line. Some had climbed onto trailer roofs for better views. Phones were everywhere, recording from every angle. Logan was in his element, playing to the crowd like a conductor leading an orchestra. He high-fived supporters, posed for photos with his Porsche, delivered sound bites designed to go viral. This is what happens when you let anyone show up. He shouted to applause and laughter. Next thing you know, they'll be racing lawnmowers out here. His friends amplified every joke, turned every comment into content for their social media feeds. Someone had started a betting pool. The odds were so lopsided they were almost insulting 15-1 against Malik. No one bet on the Accord. Malik rolled up to the starting line and was immediately hit with the absurdity of the visual contrast. Logan's Porsche was a masterpiece of German engineering carbon fiber aerodynamics, a race-tuned flat-six engine that produced 518 horsepower, a 7-speed PDK transmission that shifted faster than human thought. The car cost $240,000 base, probably closer to $280,000 with the options Logan had added. Next to it, the Accord looked like it had been assembled from parts found behind a gas station, but appearances lie. And Malik was counting on that. The track manager, a nervous-looking white guy in his 40s, who clearly hadn't anticipated his event turning into this, approached both cars with a clipboard and a megaphone. All right, gentlemen, he said, voice cracking slightly through the amplification. This is one lap, flag to flag. Standard rules apply. No contact, no crossing the center line on turns. First car across the finish wins. He looked at Malik. Sir, are you absolutely sure you want to do this? The question was posed as concern but landed like doubt. I'm sure, Malik said. The manager shrugged and backed away, probably already thinking about the liability waiver he'd had. Malik signed. Logan revved his engine, a bark of mechanical fury that turned heads and raised heartbeats. The Porsche sounded expensive, sounded fast, sounded like exactly what everyone expected to win. Malik kept his foot off the gas, no theatrics. No performance. The Accord idled with a subtle rumble that most people didn't notice, a low, throaty tone that hinted at something different underneath. But Logan noticed. For just a second, his expression changed. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as he registered that the sound coming from Malik's car wasn't stock, wasn't standard, wasn't what he'd assumed. Then the moment passed, and Logan's confidence reasserted itself. He probably convinced himself he'd imagined it. A young woman with a checkered flag stepped between the cars. The crowd fell silent, not out of respect, but anticipation. They were waiting for the wreck, the breakdown, the inevitable moment when reality reasserted itself and the natural order was restored. Malik's heartbeat slowed. His breathing deepened. His hands settled onto the steering wheel with practiced certainty. This was the moment his father had prepared him for without knowing it. Every lesson about perseverance, every story about facing down people who said no, every example of quiet dignity in the face of disrespect, it all crystallized into this single lap. This one chance to prove that their assumptions about him were as flawed as their assumptions about his car. He thought about his father's last words in the hospital, whispered through oxygen tubes and failing lungs. "Don't let them tell you who you are, Malik. You show them." The flag girl raised her arm. Logan gripped his steering wheel tighter, jaw set, ready to humiliate the man beside him. The crowd leaned forward, phones focused. The flag dropped. Asterisk, the Porsche. Launched like a missile, Logan's all-wheel drive system. Distributed power perfectly. The sticky performance tires bit into asphalt with aggressive authority, and the PDK transmission executed a flawless first-to-second shift in milliseconds. The car exploded off the line with the kind of acceleration that pressed drivers into their seats and made spectators gasp. The crowd erupted in cheers. This was what they'd come to see: dominant, overwhelming, inevitable victory. But then something happened that shouldn't have been possible. Malik's Accord didn't just launch. It detonated. The front wheels spun for a fraction of a second weight. Transfer perfectly calculated, then hooked up with violent authority. The car surged forward with a ferocity that made the Porsche's launch look almost pedestrian by comparison. The exhaust note changed from idle rumble to a scream of mechanical fury, a sound that belonged on race circuits in Japan, not in a junk car from the 90s. Logan's head snapped sideways, his expression transforming from confidence to confusion. In the space between heartbeats, the Accord was keeping pace. No, it was pulling ahead. What the fuck? Logan muttered, slamming through gears, the Porsche's engine screaming in protest as he demanded every ounce of performance the car could give. But Malik was already in third gear. The shift executed with perfect precision, no wasted time, no hesitation. His right hand moved on the shifter with the muscle memory of 10,000 practice runs. His left foot balanced the clutch with surgical precision. Every input was calculated, deliberate, exactly what the car needed exactly when it needed it. The straightaway stretched ahead, a quarter-mile of asphalt where raw power would decide the contest. On paper, Logan's Porsche should have walked away. It had more horsepower, more torque, more technology, more everything. But racing isn't about paper. Malik's engine screamed toward redline 8,500 RPM, the valve train holding together through forces that would have destroyed lesser builds. He'd spent 6 months just on the bottom end, ensuring every component could handle the stress. Now those hours of work paid dividends as the tachometer climbed into a range Honda never intended this engine to reach. He shifted into fourth with the same clinical precision. The Accord surged again. Logan stared in disbelief as the junk car pulled alongside his $250,000 machine. This wasn't supposed to happen. The script was written. The outcome predetermined. The crowd's cheers transformed into something else: gasps of surprise, confused murmurs, the sound of cognitive dissonance happening in real time. Holy shit, is that actually happening? How is he keeping up? That can't be stock. He must be cheating somehow. They reached the first turn at speed that made inexperienced drivers lift off the throttle, let momentum carry them wide, scrub off valuable seconds. Logan braked hard, expensive carbon ceramic discs glowing orange and turned in. The Porsche's advanced stability control managing weight transfer and maintaining grip through computerized perfection. But Malik didn't need computers. He heel-toed. The downshift right foot blipping the throttle while his left worked the clutch. A technique that took years to master but allowed him to perfectly match engine and transmission speed. The car rotated into the turn with balance that seemed to defy its economy car origins. He'd rebuilt the suspension geometry specifically for this, for weight transfer, for predictable handling, for the ability to push the car to its absolute limits without it biting back unpredictably. Every component worked in harmony, responding to his inputs with mechanical honesty that expensive cars often filtered out in the name of comfort and ease. Logan took the racing line. The textbook path through the corner, the one his driving instructor had taught him, the one that should have been optimal. But Malik took a different line. Tighter entry, later apex, earlier throttle application. It was aggressive, risky, the kind of line that required absolute trust in your car and your own skills. Most drivers wouldn't attempt it. Most drivers didn't need to dot. Malik wasn't most drivers. He powered out of the turn ahead of Logan by half a car length. The crowd fell silent. Logan's face twisted with rage and disbelief. He'd spent $15,000 on a professional driving course. He'd practiced on this track dozens of times. He'd never been beaten by someone driving something so far beneath his car's performance envelope. He mashed the throttle, the Porsche's engine screaming its protest, trying to make up ground through pure force. But force without finesse is just noise. The second turn approached, a sweeping right-hander that tightened progressively, a corner that punished hesitation and rewarded commitment. Logan braked early, uncertainty creeping into his inputs. He'd seen what Malik could do in the previous turn, and suddenly his own abilities felt inadequate. Malik braked later, harder, trusting the upgraded brake system he'd installed. 4-piston. Calipers bit down on cross-drilled rotors with authority that transformed kinetic energy into heat and control. He turned in at a speed that would have terrified a lesser driver, feeling the car's weight transfer onto the outside tires, feeling the suspension compress and load, exactly as he designed it to. The car rotated through the corner like it was on rails. Logan tried to match the pace and nearly lost control, the Porsche's rear end stepping out as he overcorrected stability. Control flashing warning lights on the dashboard, saving him from a spin that would have ended in the grass and humiliation dot by the time he corrected and got back on the throttle. Malik had extended his lead to 2 car lengths. They entered the back section of the track, a series of technical corners that demanded rhythm and flow, where momentum mattered more than straight-line speed. This was where driving skill separated the talented from the merely wealthy. Malik flowed through the section like water, finding its path downhill, smooth inputs, minimal steering corrections, every motion efficient and purposeful. He'd visualized this section hundreds of times, had walked it on foot to memorize every pavement change, every subtle grip variation. Logan attacked the same corners with desperation, trying to muscle the Porsche through turns that required finesse. His inputs were abrupt, his lines inconsistent, his frustration growing with every apex he missed. 3 car lengths. 4. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Phones recorded, but people had stopped cheering, stopped commenting, stopped doing anything except trying to process what they were witnessing. The impossible was happening. Asterisk. The man they'd mocked was destroying the man they'd celebrated. Marcus stood near the fence, tears streaming down his face, fist pressed against his mouth to keep from shouting. He'd watched 50 years of black drivers being overlooked, undervalued, dismissed. He'd seen talent wasted because money and opportunity went elsewhere. And now, in this moment on this track, someone was pushing back against all of it. The final straight approach, the longest section of track, where Logan's power advantage should have allowed him to close the gap, where expensive engineering should have overcome budget limitations. Logan floored it. The Porsche speedometer climbing past 120 miles per hour, past 130. The engine delivering every ounce of factory performance, but Malik was already there, his car screaming at speeds no Accord was ever meant to reach. The aerodynamics he'd carefully optimized, keeping the car stable even as the speedometer touched 135, 138, 142. Numbers that made the suspension work overtime, made the tires heat up to the edge of their capability, made every component strain against the limits of what was possible. But Malik had built this car to live at those limits. Logan gained ground, maybe a car length, maybe half. The Porsche's raw power finally making a difference, but it wasn't enough. The finish line approached. Logan pushed harder, downshifted, wrung every last revolution from the flat-six engine. Malik crossed the line 5 car lengths ahead. The aftermath. When silence becomes deafening 12001500 words for 3 full seconds. Nobody moved. The crowd stood frozen. processing information that conflicted with everything they'd assumed. Phones still recorded, but hands had lowered, eyes wide, mouths open. Malik coasted through the cool-down lap, his heart pounding but his hands steady, his breathing controlled, his mind clear. He'd done it. Not just won the race, but demolished every assumption they'd made about him. He'd beaten Logan so thoroughly that even the excuses would sound hollow. He parked the Accord back in his corner of the paddock, killed the engine, and sat in silence for a moment. The car ticked and cooled around him, metal contracting, fluid settling. He placed his hand on the dashboard. "We did it, Dad," he whispered. Logan's Porsche rolled to a stop near the finish line. He didn't immediately get out. He sat there, both hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing. His face was red, whether from exertion, embarrassment, or rage was impossible to tell. Probably all three. His friends approached tentatively, unsure what to say. How do you comfort someone who just had their worldview shattered in front of an audience? "Dude, I think something was wrong with your car. Maybe he has nitrous or something." That had to be illegal, right? "Nobody told us he was running." Logan held up a hand, cutting them off. He knew what they were doing, constructing a narrative. That absolved him of responsibility, that protected his ego, that maintained the story they all wanted to believe. But he'd been in that car. He'd felt what happened. The Accord hadn't just been fast. It had been driven by someone who understood racing in a way Logan never would. Money had bought him a superior car, but it couldn't buy him superior skill. The truth of that sat in his chest like a stone. Malik climbed out of the Accord to scattered, uncertain applause. The kind people give when they're not sure how to react, when social expectations conflict with personal feelings. A few genuine claps came from unexpected places. The older black man, Marcus, now openly crying and grinning. A young Latino teenager who'd been watching from the cheap seats. A white woman in her 60s who approached Malik with surprising directness. "That was extraordinary," she said simply. "My late husband would have loved to see that." "Thank you, ma'am," Malik said. But most people kept their distance, watching him like he was a puzzle they couldn't solve. A glitch in the matrix that didn't fit their programming. The tech inspector who'd cleared Malik's car earlier pushed through the crowd with purpose, his expression serious. For a moment, Malik felt his stomach drop. Here it comes, he thought. The accusations, the demands to re-inspect, the post-race disqualification. But the inspector extended his hand. "That was some of the finest driving I've seen on this track," he said. "And that car, that's real craftsmanship. I'd be honored if you'd let me look under the hood sometime. Off the clock. I'd like to learn from it." They shook hands, and Malik felt some of the tension drain from his shoulders. Not everyone was against him. Not everyone had decided his story before hearing it. But then came the whispers he'd been expecting. "You think he's running something illegal? How do we know that engine's even street legal? Probably has like 1,000 horsepower turbo hidden somewhere. Should report this to the track officials. Can't just let people show up with who knows what." The rationalizations were already building, the protective walls going up around their shattered assumptions. They couldn't accept that a black man with a junk car had simply been better prepared, better skilled, better focused. There had to be another explanation. There had to be cheating involved, because the alternative that they'd been wrong, that their judgment had been clouded by prejudice, that the person they'd dismissed was actually exceptional, that was too uncomfortable to accept. Logan finally emerged from his Porsche. His friends swarmed him immediately, already spinning. Narratives about mechanical issues and unfair advantages. He waved them off and walked toward Malik with deliberate steps. The crowd parted, sensing confrontation, phones rising again to capture whatever happened next. Malik straightened, preparing for accusations, for excuses, for whatever blow Logan's ego needed to deliver to protect itself. But Logan stopped 3 feet away and just looked at him. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time. The superiority was gone from his expression, replaced by something more complex: confusion, frustration, a hint of something that might have been respect struggling against a lifetime of learned prejudice. That was Logan started, then stopped. He seemed genuinely at a loss for words. How? How what? Malik asked evenly. "How did you?" Logan gestured vaguely at the Accord. "That car. I don't understand. 3 years of work, Malik said. Every night after my day job, every weekend, every dollar I could spare. My father's tools. YouTube tutorials, forums, trial and error. Mostly error at first. He met Logan's eyes directly. I built something I could be proud of because I didn't have the luxury of buying it. The words landed with more weight than Malik intended. Logan flinched slightly, recognizing the implicit criticism. You bought your way into this. I earned it. Look, Logan said, lowering his voice, what I said before about the car and I was just joking around. I didn't mean anything by it. There it was. The retreat into casual dismissal. It was just a joke. Don't be so sensitive. I didn't mean it the way you took it. The familiar script of people who'd never had to think carefully about their words. Because the world was designed to accommodate their thoughtlessness. Yes, you did, Malik said quietly. You meant all of it. You looked at me in my car and decided we didn't belong here. You decided that before you knew anything about me or what I was capable of. And everything you said after that was designed. To make me feel small so you could feel bigger. Logan's jaw tightened. For a moment, anger flashed across his face. How dare this man speak to him like this? Refused to accept his half apology, refused to make this comfortable for him. But then something else happened. Something Logan hadn't expected. He felt ashamed. Not. Performative shame, not the kind you express because it's expected. Real shame. The kind that sits in your gut and makes you see yourself through someone else's eyes and recognize that what you see is ugly. You're right, he said finally. The words came out rough, reluctant, but genuine. I was an asshole. I made assumptions. I'm sorry. The crowd murmured. This wasn't the ending they'd expected either. Malik studied Logan's face, looking for sincerity beneath the discomfort. He found it not much, not perfectly formed, but real enough. I appreciate you saying that, Malik said. But an apology doesn't erase what happened. Doesn't change the fact that everyone here saw what you did, and most of them agreed with you until I proved you wrong. He looked past Logan at the crowd. The question is what happens next time. Next time there's someone who doesn't fit your picture of what belongs. What do you do then? Logan had no answer. Neither did anyone else. Malik turned back to his car, began packing his tools, preparing to leave. Marcus approached again. This time with 3 other black workers from the track mechanics, maintenance crew, people who existed in the background of places like this. Man, you don't know what you just did, one of them said, voice thick with emotion. We've been working here for years, taking their shit, being invisible. And you just... He shook, his head unable to finish. You made us visible, Marcus said simply. Thank you. They helped Malik load his equipment, a small gesture that felt monumental in the context of the day. Solidarity, recognition, the acknowledgement that his victory was shared by everyone who'd ever been dismissed, underestimated, told. They weren't good enough. As Malik prepared to drive away, a young black teenager, maybe 16, ran up to the car, breathless. Hey, mister, he said. Can I ask you something? How'd you learn to do all that? Build the car and everything, Malik smiled. Same way anyone learns anything. You start, you fail, you try again, you fail better. You don't let people tell you. It's impossible. But what if people keep saying you can't? Then you prove them wrong, Malik said. Not for them. For yourself. And for the next person who looks like you and needs to know it's possible. The kid nodded. Something shifting in his expression, hope taking root where doubt had lived. Malik drove away from Claiborne Motorsports Park the same way he'd arrived alone. In a car most people wouldn't look twice at, carrying tools that had belonged to his father. But everything had changed anyway. Within hours, videos of the race exploded across social media. Not just on racing forums, but everywhere: Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Reddit. The story was too perfect, too symbolic. Too necessary for people who'd been waiting to see someone like Logan get humbled. The comments sections filled with familiar patterns. Some people celebrated. This is what it looks like when skill beats money. Others made excuses. That Honda must have had a $50,000 engine swap. No way stock beats a Porsche. Some acknowledged the deeper meaning. The way that crowd treated him before the race, that's the real story here. And inevitably some deflected, why does everything have to be about race? It's just cars. But the people asking that last question were the ones who never had to think about race because it had never been used against them. They were the ones who could watch Logan mock Malik and see only harmless banter, who could hear the assumptions, and dismiss them as jokes, who could ignore the weight of history pressing down on every interaction because that weight had never touched their shoulders. For them, it was just cars. For Malik, it was Tuesday. Logan spent the next week watching the video spread, reading comments that ranged from supportive to scathing. He'd expected to be embarrassed by losing. He hadn't expected to become a symbol of entitled privilege getting a wake-up call. Some of his friends stood by him, helping construct narratives about mechanical failures and lucky breaks. But others quietly distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with a story that made them examine their own assumptions. Late one night, Logan sat in his home office, a converted bedroom in his $3.2 million house, and rewatched the race. Footage. He studied Malik's driving, his lines through corners, his precision. He watched his own inputs, his mistakes, the moments where money and technology couldn't compensate for the gap in skill and dedication. He thought about the look on Malik's face before the race, not anger, not fear, but something like resignation, mixed with determination. The expression of someone who'd been in this position before, who'd learned to swallow indignity and channel it elsewhere. Logan had apologized at the track, because shame had caught him off guard. But now, alone with the footage, he had to decide if that shame would transform into something more understanding, growth, change, or if it would calcify into resentment and defensive pride. He didn't have an answer yet. For Marcus and the other black workers at Claiborne, Malik's victory became a story they told with pride. Something to point to when they felt invisible, when they were talked over in meetings, when someone made assumptions about their capabilities. "You see what happened when they gave one of us a fair shot?" Marcus would say. "That's what's possible. When they stopped standing in our way." The track continued hosting events, continued catering to wealthy clients, continued operating in the same patterns. But something had shifted, subtle, fragile, but real. A few more people asked questions before making assumptions. A few more voices pushed back against casual prejudice. A few more eyes were open to the ways bias operated in their spaces. It wasn't a revolution. It was barely progress, but it was movement. Malik went back to his regular life, working at the auto parts store, helping his mother with bills, tinkering in the garage on weekends. The attention from the race faded after a few weeks, the internet moving on to the next story the next moment. But he received messages, dozens, then hundreds. Other black men and women who'd been told they weren't good enough, who'd been dismissed. In job interviews and loan applications and college admissions. People who saw themselves in his story and needed to know someone had pushed back and won. A young woman from Detroit who'd been denied funding for her startup despite strong metrics. She messaged, "Your race gave me the courage to try again." Father from Atlanta whose son loved racing but had been discouraged by teachers who steered black kids away from STEM. He messaged, "You showed my boy that his dreams are possible." A mechanic from Oakland who'd been passed over for promotion 5 times while less qualified white colleagues advanced. She messaged, "I'm not backing down anymore, thank you." Malik read every message. He responded when he could, offering encouragement, sharing the lessons he'd learned, reminding them that the system was designed to make them doubt themselves, and that doubt was the cage they needed to escape. One evening, 6 months after the race, Malik sat in his garage working on the Accord's next upgrade. The car had become semi-famous in certain circles, but to him it was still his father's car, still the place where memory and purpose intersected. His phone buzzed. An email from the Claiborne track coordinator. "We're hosting a charity event in 2 months raising money for youth automotive programs in underserved communities. We'd be honored if you'd participate and maybe speak to the kids about your journey. No pressure, but I thought you should know that race you ran changed some minds here, mine included." Malik smiled. One event wouldn't fix systemic racism. One race wouldn't erase decades of discrimination. One victory wouldn't level a playing field that had been tilted since. Before he was born, but it was a start, and sometimes starting is the hardest part. He typed a response accepting the invitation, then returned to his work hands stained with grease, surrounded by tools that remembered his father's touch, building something that honored the past while racing toward a future where stories like his wouldn't be extraordinary, they'd just be Tuesday, and maybe that would be progress enough.